our series called Stories Jesus Told. It's a series about parables, these really creative, enigmatic, sometimes confusing stories that Jesus told. Sometimes we don't think they're confusing because we seem to sort of get an initial meaning, but they're kind of cryptic, enigmatic. They've got layers of meaning in them. Very challenging, brilliant stories that Jesus told. I've often wondered, why didn't Jesus write a book? I don't know if you've ever thought about that. You know, there's books written about Jesus, or information written about Jesus. Ancient literature, modern literature for sure as well. We have the scriptures, all writings about Jesus. And if I was Jesus, and I felt like I'm really tuned into truth, I'd probably just, rather than telling all these stories and moving around from city to city, I'd probably just sit people down and say, look, write this down. Here's the absolute truth. Here's the meaning of life. And Jesus doesn't do that. And I think the reason probably is because, as we found, people who think they've got the truth, or people who sort of codify the truth, often get a little weird. You know, we start, let's face it, that's the story of religion really, isn't it? So it's the story of Christianity in many ways, where we kind of think we have the truth, and then we get very precious with it, and we think we're right. And somehow us being right means other people must be wrong. And it drives a wedge between people. And it can be really destructive. Jesus doesn't operate that way. Jesus is telling stories, doing things, interacting with real life. You almost get a sense that Jesus is not, I wouldn't say making up as he goes along, but it's sort of working things out in real life, which is what Jesus seems to have come to do, to help us live this real life that we all have, that we're all living at the moment. It's not abstract, it's a very real, concrete life. How do we live in this context? And Jesus doesn't just kind of say this is the truth and the only truth, but is actually quite clever in, for instance, when the Jewish people would say it's all about the law, Jesus kind of flips it and goes out and picks some ears of corn and on the Sabbath and kind of breaks the law. It's as though Jesus is saying, well, yes, but no. And then when people start getting sort of a little bit precious about, it's not the law, we've got this other way that's about grace and permission, and it's not condemning, then Jesus says, wait a minute, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. And if your righteousness doesn't surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees, then you can't be part of the kingdom of God. So Jesus is constantly saying, yes, but think about this, because we have this tendency, it seems, to think that we're right, that we're good, that we know the truth. And to those issues, and to people like that, people like us, Jesus would tell parables to kind of flip it. So if you think you're right, well, what about this? If you think you're good, well, what about that? If you think they're bad, well, let me tell you a story. And then we have these parables, these stories that get us thinking and that draw us in to what's really going on in our own hearts, our own minds, and what might be going on in the hearts and minds of the people that we actually feel are different to us, or we don't think they're as human as we are. So Jesus tells these brilliant stories that are designed, it seems, to bring us together rather than push us apart. Jesus seems more interested in us coming together and understanding our commonality and appreciating that and going on this journey of oneness, if you like. Jesus seems way more concerned about that than who's right and who's wrong. And so these stories kind of illumine those kinds of issues. And that's what draws us into them. And today's parable is, I think, a really great example of that. And so let's jump right into it. Maybe we can put it up, Greg, that's great. So it's another pretty short parable. To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He could not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Okay, so there's the parable. I think it's a parable that we might naturally like. It seems to be a parable about, as Luke, the author of Luke, introduces it, is about somebody who's confident in their own righteousness and looks down on somebody else. None of us like that. It's about a Pharisee, a very religious person who thinks they're great, is very self-righteous, and is sort of gloating in their self-righteousness. It's also about a tax collector, an outcast, somebody who feels on the outside of the community, somebody that Jesus loved. Jesus always bringing outsiders in, especially tax collectors. And it's about that person actually being very repentant, very sorry about what they've done. And that is what justifies them. They're viewed as justified, and the Pharisee is condemned. It's a story about self-righteousness and gloating and looking down on people. And I think we feel pretty comfortable with that. That seems to make sense. I think we feel comfortable with that. If you think about it from a political angle, we always favor the underdog, right? We like the underdog to get ahead. We want to include people who've been oppressed, people who are on the outside. It sort of makes sense, and we see the Pharisee is very privileged. And so, that from a political point of view, it makes sense, a societal point of view. From a personal point of view, it makes sense, because I think probably all of us could say we've been in this situation, either in a kind of religious, spiritual way, or maybe in a relational way, where we felt like we've blown it, that we've messed up our life, maybe we've hurt somebody, or we've done something that we feel ashamed of. And it's so beautiful to think that there's such a thing as forgiveness, whether we think about that as forgiveness from God or forgiveness from people that we've hurt. I think we share that in common with this character, the tax collector. And then, of course, from a religious point of view, it makes sense to us because we are in our sort of enlightened state, particularly post-Reformation, the last 500 years or so, where we realize that, oh no, it's not about doing the right things, it's not about works, it's not about following the law and being perfect. It's about grace. It's about God's love, God's forgiveness, and it's to do with the heart and the condition of our heart. And all that makes sense. So that's what the parable means, it seems. And I could sit down and we're done. But that's not going to happen, right? At least that's not going to happen. Because and let's think about it, there are a few things here that are at least a little troubling. There's a few strands that we feel like maybe if we tug them on a bit, will things begin to unravel. The first one is this: it's way too comfortable, right? I mean, we're sort of looking back on this parable and saying, oh, that's a great story. It's sort of confirming what we believe and what we know already, and so it has some historical value, but it's not challenging really in any way. And that by definition means we've probably missed the whole point of it, right? Because these stories are meant to be really, really challenging, and challenging through the generations, and they have layers of meaning, layers of challenge in them. So we might be missing the point. That's one thing. Secondly, does it really not matter what you do? So this tax collector just says, have mercy on me, and gets off scot-free apparently. And this Pharisee, who's been trying really hard, is apparently not accepted. And that seems a little bit unjust. And so there's a little bit of a question mark there, I think. There is for me, anyway. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly here, by the end of the story, we're feeling and thinking, thank God I'm not like that self-righteous Pharisee, right? Gotcha. So the parable is a very clever parable, because it's got us. Because that's what we're thinking, and that's the exact thing at the beginning that Jesus is saying, or the author of Luke is actually saying, we shouldn't be doing. This is a parable about not being self-righteous and looking down on other people. And I don't think it's like a trap. It's not like Jesus is trying to catch us out and say, hey, you think you're great, you're not really. I think what's happening here is Jesus saying, think again. That's what repent means. Think again about your life. Like, be careful. If you think you're in the right, if you're feeling comfortable, maybe you shouldn't be so comfortable. Maybe you're not so right. Maybe they're not so wrong. And again, Jesus is trying to bring us together rather than push us further apart. So, given that, let's think a little bit more about the parable. Because if we're feeling sort of caught by it, we might, one reaction is to say, right, let's leave it alone. I'm not going to go there. Or we just say, right, let's dive in and find out what's going on here. And we did this last week, if you remember. We sort of looked a little bit closer at some of the language, some of the structure of the parable. We'll do something similar today. We'll just go through each verse, actually. There's only a few verses, 5 verses. But first of all, let's think about something we talked about last week, which was stereotypes. You know, we had a story last week, which actually is the story immediately before this one. It was the parable about the widow and the judge. And we talked about how we stereotype and have our views of what those people are, what those stereotypes mean. And clearly we have this with the Pharisee and the tax collector. Okay, so the Pharisee, in our view, I mean, Pharisee has become a colloquial term to mean hypocrite, hasn't it? It's in everyday language. And we don't really say, oh, you're such a tax collector, as an insult to somebody. I guess unless they work for the IRS, but maybe we do that. But we do say, what a Pharisee. You know, so the Pharisees in our mind are these hypocritical, self-righteous bigots. And we tend to associate them with every enemy class that we have, right? They're bad people. So the people that we think about, we put them in, or we put Pharisees in that bracket, bad people. And then we have tax collectors. Jesus loved tax collectors. And we sort of associate them in a way with other stereotypes that Jesus loved. People generically known as sinners, you know, outcasts and lepers and prostitutes, etc. And we tend to group them in with the victim class, right? So, poor old tax collectors. So we feel sorry for this guy. And we kind of empathize with his shame and his guilt because he's the victim in the story. Except that wasn't how the people of Jesus' day would have viewed these two characters. When Jesus says 2 people went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, one a tax collector, the people would be thinking, the Pharisee's the good person. And Pharisees weren't necessarily all bad. Some of them had run-ins with Jesus, and Jesus had some very strong words for Pharisees, for sure. But Pharisees were trying to live good lives. They're good people. They weren't necessarily, the audience of Jesus at that time won't necessarily be thinking, oh, hypocrite goes up to the temple. They're thinking, there's a good person going up to the temple. When the tax collector gets mentioned, they're thinking abusive, traitor, bully, violent, aggressive, rich at the expense of other people. Because tax collectors were the Romans' tool, so they were Jewish people that the Romans used to collect taxes from their own people, the local people. And they wouldn't pay them. They would have to sort of skim money off the top, charge more than they were going to give to the Romans in order to pay themselves. And many of them cheated so much that they got quite rich. So I guarantee you, if we were there then, or if we take the equivalent of what that might be now, and there's a question actually in the discussion questions about who might we think of as tax collectors now? Right, and I don't want to fill in the blank for you because, but we've all got, think of people who are abusive, extortioners, people who manipulate the system, who sort of work with abusive systems. Let's fill in those blanks, but we would not be advocating for them. We would not see them as victims. We would not be saying, poor old tax collectors, let's stand up for the tax collector. We need to protect the tax collectors. That just wouldn't be the case. And yet somehow, we're so far removed from the text that we think he's the good guy and the Pharisee's the bad guy. Which is, again, that's immediately, I think, a sort of a warning to us. Maybe we're not quite getting what this parable might mean. So, with that in mind, let's just go through it a verse or two at a time. So, the author of Luke has a little one-verse introduction. To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Okay, so as I mentioned, it follows straight on from the parable that we looked at last week. It might be tempting to think that this is Jesus having a go at the Pharisees, that he's telling this parable to the Pharisees. But the context is to some who are confident. That's who he's addressing, it seems. And if we sort of back up to the beginning of the chapter, and when Jesus tells the previous story, he's talking to his disciples. I mean, and when this follows on to the next story, there's no sense that he stopped talking to his disciples. So Jesus is talking to his followers here. So in other words, this isn't like, I've got a message for you hypocritical Pharisees. This is, I've got a message for you followers of Jesus, right? People like you and me, who apparently have the potential to be self-righteous and look down on other people. So that's the intro. There's no sense, I think, really in that first section there, to some who are confident in their own righteousness and look down on other people. So there's no sense, I think, that being confident in your own righteousness is wrong. It's wrong when we, from that place of righteousness or self-righteousness, look down on somebody else. There's a little bit of ambiguity there, I think. Jesus told this parable, okay? So to address that issue, Jesus tells this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. So we've already talked about the fact that, you know, the implications or the connotations of Pharisee and tax collector are probably different to the original listeners than they are to us. We're immediately predisposed to the tax collector. They go up to the temple to pray. Now, there were 2 times each day where people would go to the temple to pray. There were the prayers of atonement at dawn and at the equivalent of 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And you'd go up there, make yourself ritually clean, go into the temple, a lamb would be sacrificed. So you go collectively, you know, people would go, lamb would be sacrificed, the blood would be sprinkled on the altar. And then the high priest would go in and offer incense into the Holy of Holies, offer incense. And that was the atonement sacrifice. It was the confession, the collective confession and forgiveness of the sins of the people. It was a communal thing. And some people at those times who weren't in Jerusalem or who couldn't make it to the temple would pray at those times and joining in with, it's kind of like, God forgive us, not just forgive me. It was an act of repentance. And this is why they would go up to the temple. So we've got these 2 people, one of whom we think of as religious and one who's not religious. Again, we're kind of on the side of the not religious person, but they've both gone to the temple. So there's a lot more commonality here. They're both religious people going to the temple for forgiveness or participating in this forgiveness ritual. Okay, let's move on. So here's the prayer of the Pharisee. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. So there's sort of two aspects to this. He stands, or there's several, but there's sort of 2 sections to it. He stands by himself. Some people have said that's very, he's sort of separating himself from the others because he's too good for them, which may be the case. It might be that he's just looking for a bit of space, some sort of, some solitude, some privacy in this sort of, this religious moment that he's about to enter into. I think there's actually, this issue of space, there's multiple issues of space in this parable. And I think there's some other significance to it, which we'll get into. But, he could be being aloof and proud, possibly. Maybe it's to do with the fact that self-righteousness and religion often removes us from each other. It pushes us away. So he's kind of distanced in some way. He says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, and adulterers. That sounds pretty self-righteous, right, straight off the bat. But when we look at this, so the word robbers there, in the original Greek language, it means extortioners, people who forcibly extract money from others. We're not talking pickpockets or petty thieves. We're talking people who are manipulating others, oppressing others, and getting money from them. Evildoers, the word there is unjust people who are unjust. It's the same word that we looked at last week when we talked about the judge. And then adulterers, I think we all know what that is. But if you think about these 3 things, they're sort of categorical things. Extortioners are not good people, right? They're abusive people. The tax collector is a bit of an extortioner. all these three categories are sins, if you like, or actions against other people, against the community. They're oppressive in many respects. So there's extortion, there's unjust actions, and then there's adultery, which is abusing women, and it's misogyny, it's benefiting and participating in the patriarchal system. And I think probably all of us would like to think that we don't live that way, right? And that it's important we don't live that way. And we might not be saying, thank God I'm not like that, but we're pretty confident that that's not what we want to be, right? And we're putting kind of value in the fact that we're not abusers, we're not extortioners, we're for justice. We want justice in our relationships. We don't betray people. We're not unfaithful to people. There's a certain amount of confidence we might have in being about those things. So in some respects, this isn't necessarily wrong that the Pharisee is saying these things. And if we're honest, we probably think these things. And as we were talking about last week, if we think about prayer as what you do at prayer time, we might not use this kind of language. But if we think about prayer as what our existential reality is, it's our sort of constant communion with God, then we think those things probably a lot of the time. The problem is, though, he then goes on to say, or even like this tax collector. So now he's comparing himself. Now he's looking down on somebody. It's now become very personal. He's associating at least some of those wrongdoings with a person that he sees in the temple praying with him. So now it's comparative. Now it's me and him. Now it's more distance. That, okay, I may be good, but he's bad. And then he says, I fast twice a week and I have a tenth of all I get. And this is almost comical, cartoonish caricature of being a goody-goody. Because in the culture of the day, in the Jewish culture of the day, you were only asked to fast once a year, and that was on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. The Pharisees would fast 2 days before and 2 days after the three major festivals. So they fasted 12 days a year, or if you include the actual day of the festival, 15 days a year. So the Pharisees were very, very committed. This Pharisee is fasting twice a week. That's 104 times a year. So talk about going above and beyond. He gives a tenth of all he gets. Now, that's the tithe. So part of the culture was, religiously, you would tithe. You'd give away 10% of certain things. There was a tithe on food, on certain crops. But the rabbis had a lot of, I wouldn't say get-out clauses, but they didn't expect that from everybody, or for everybody to do that for everything. There's lots of information about how, well, you tithe on that, but not on this, and it was kind of reasonable. This guy tithes on everything he has, everything he gets, so he's going above and beyond. Now again, that might sound very self-righteous and sort of very religious, etc. But let me give you a little example. Is it wrong to go above and beyond? Like when it comes to things like justice and giving. So let's remember that this fasting, for instance, was fasting on behalf of the whole community. It's fasting about the forgiveness of the community on the Day of Atonement and also on those other festivals. It's not a selfish act. It can be done in a selfish way, but it's not, by definition, a selfish act. And tithing was giving to the poor. It was giving away to others. Is it wrong to go above and beyond? Does that make you some sort of zealous religious fanatic? I give an illustration of this. And there's two sides to it, obviously. So we used to go on vacation as a family when the kids were younger to the Outer Banks. And in the particular area that we stayed, there was no, this is quite a few years ago now. My kids are all grown up. But in the particular area that we stayed, there was no recycling. So I used to save the recycling that we generated and pack it into the car for the drive home and recycle it when I got home. And my kids, it would be like, oh, kids, you've got to just move over and budge over, because we would sort of Yeah, there was a few wine bottles in there and that kind of thing. Not too many, but we sort of have all this recycling. And they would say, Dad, you're going over the top. You're going over the top. So maybe I was. I don't know. Maybe I was. But isn't recycling a good thing? It was to me. However, I remember that same area, we had somebody over to our house for dinner. And I can't remember exactly what happened, but they got up to throw something away, and it was something you could recycle. And we said, oh, just put that over there because you can recycle it. And again, my kids were a lot younger. And they said, oh, we don't bother recycling. And my kids went, there was this dead silence in the room where somebody doesn't recycle. And it was like shock, horror. So you can see how this can go both ways, right? It can become obsessive, or it can become sort of self-congratulatory, our good actions. And it can also become sort of where we sort of take the higher ground, and we're looking down on people who maybe don't do the things that we do, or don't see life the same way that we do, right? So this, again, like with all these parables, there's ambiguity in this. It's good, but it could be self-righteous. And we're not 100% sure, except that he's looking down on somebody. And that's obviously not right. Okay, that's obviously not right. Okay, let's go on to the tax collector. So the tax collector stood at a distance. We've got this space issue again. Maybe he's ashamed. He's sort of backing away because he doesn't, he's worried what people will think of him. We're not 100% sure. Certainly, we get this evidence of shame because it says the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven. He couldn't bring himself to look up, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And we empathize with that, as we were saying at the beginning, that we can all, I think, identify with this. Now that word mercy, it's in the Greek, it's hilaskomai. It's a very technical word. It's only used in one other place in the Christian scriptures, and that's in the book of Hebrews, where it also has a very technical meaning. It's a religious technical word. It means atonement or propitiation. It's this whole idea of forgiveness through ritual, forgiveness through sacrifice. The normal word for mercy, eleo, is not used here. It's used everywhere else for mercy. So later on in this same chapter, there's a blind person that cries out to Jesus, have mercy on me, and it's a totally different word. So it's unusual, and you get the sense here that yes, this guy's contrite, but he's very much talking religiously. He's a little bit like the Pharisee in that respect. He's here for, I want forgiveness on a technical basis. And he seems contrite for sure, but we don't get any sense here of, has he gone away different? I mean, does he go away still a tax collector? Does he just say, I need forgiveness, I want forgiveness, got it, now I'm going to go off and do what I want again, and then I'm going to come back again for forgiveness? We don't know, actually, we don't know. But what we do get is this sense that at least he's sorry, at least he sees his need for forgiveness, in a way that the Pharisee didn't, right? The Pharisee at no point seems to understand that they too have issues. They too are part of the problem. Even if they are trying to be a solution, if they're trying to be an answer, they too are part of the problem. Something that I think we all need to understand in all our righteousness, because it seems that when the Pharisee looks down on this tax collector, the Pharisee's made up his mind already about this tax collector. He doesn't necessarily know that the tax collector, or where the tax collector is coming from. And this is, I think, part of the distance issue, that they're separated from each other. And in the temple, you would hear people praying because you prayed out loud. And I think perhaps the author, or even Jesus telling the story, is cueing us into the fact that the Pharisee can't hear this guy's prayer. He won't be able to, he's too far away to hear it. So the Pharisee doesn't know that actually this tax collector is sorry. And so, but the point being, it doesn't matter. The Pharisee's not being called self-righteous because he could hear this person saying sorry and he still looked down on him. No, just the looking down on him, whether he's sorry or not, is the issue here for Jesus in terms of the self-righteousness. And I'm sort of reading into the text a bit, but I wonder if that's what this sense of separation why we're being shown this distance between the two. And don't we all do that? Let's think about it. Again, don't we kind of get mad at people who we think are colluding with an abusive system? Don't we think, like, if only they would just stop being like that, or voting for people who are like that, even though they may be poor and actually colluding with a system that doesn't benefit them in any sense, if only they would stop, things would be okay. And this was the notion of the Pharisees, which was like, all these people committing these acts that alienate themselves from the community are also alienating all of us from God. Because it's a collective thing. And that's why the Romans have overrun us. Because if we would just get our act together, then God would rescue us, God would redeem us, that our community would be healed. And there's all these people, messing it up for everybody else kind of thing. But again, I think we all think that, whatever side we're on. It's the bloody Trump voters, or it's the stupid liberals, or whatever it is. We all have our view about the other side, and our rightness and their wrongness, and we look down on them. Now, this doesn't mean we can't disagree. Doesn't mean, I think the Pharisee is absolutely right for saying extortion's wrong, injustice is wrong, adultery is wrong. I think that's all right. It's right to think those things, but it's not right to look down on people who may not have to adhere to the same standards that we have, or might disagree with us. We can disagree, and we can even oppose, but once we dehumanize, once we create that gap between us, there's something really wrong going on, and that's what Jesus is addressing. Let's look at this last section as we wrap up here. I tell you, this man, the tax collector, rather than the other, the Pharisee, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So that refrain, that sort of coda, all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted, is a familiar one with Jesus. In a few chapters earlier in Luke, he told, maybe we can look at that, Greg, he told a story about, don't sit when you go to a wedding banquet, when you go to a party, don't take the best seat, because somebody more important is going to come along, and then you'll be embarrassed and have to sit somewhere else. So he goes, but when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So that seems the moral of this parable, right? That, if you put yourself up there, you're going to fall. If you could just take a lower view of yourself, a more realistic view of yourself, and understand your complicity in all the problems of the world as well, then you're raised up. That's higher consciousness. That seems the moral of the story. Now, maybe we can go back to that previous verse, Greg. Would that be okay? It starts off saying, I tell you, this man rather than the other went home justified before God. Now, that implies that actually the tax collector was the one in the right, if you like, the one who was righteous, the one who was justified. And the Pharisee is condemned. The Pharisee is self-righteous and therefore not participating in the good life, the righteous life. And to a large degree that makes sense, and that was the sort of the meaning we sort of talked about right at the beginning. It's interesting that when you think about why they've gone to the temple for forgiveness. And at no point does the Pharisee ask for forgiveness. So as the incense is going up to heaven as a prayer of forgiveness, the Pharisee is not really participating in that at all. The Pharisee is just resting on the fact that at least I'm not as bad as that guy. There's no ownership. So there's no participation in mercy. Whereas the tax collector, that's pretty much all he's doing, participating in mercy. Have mercy on me. So you can see how one in that instance might be in and the other might be out. However, pretty much every English translation I've looked at uses this translation. I tell you, this man rather than the other went home justified. But some commentators, some scholars, and particularly ones who are from a Jewish background, who aren't so predisposed to thinking the Pharisees are automatically a hypocrite, interpret that slightly different or translate it slightly differently. The Greek there is para-ekenos. Para, a preposition meaning alongside, next to, and ekenos or ekainos meaning the other. So it's alongside the other, but that can be interpreted all kinds of different ways, can be translated all kinds of different ways. It can be translated, so this one compared to the other went home righteous, meaning one's righteous and one's not. But it can also be translated, this one alongside, in other words, as well as the other went home righteous. In other words, the Pharisees' righteousness is a given. The good news is that even this despicable tax collector who should be on the outside is included because their heart is in the right place. They're asking for forgiveness. That's incredible good news. So it's not like the Pharisees excluded, but rather they're both part of this inclusion. Another way, and perhaps more shocking interpretation or translation, and it is a parable after all, so shocking's okay. I tell you, this man, para-ekenos, because of the other, went home righteous. And what the heck does that mean? Well, perhaps this is a collective, it comes back to a collective thing again. That we tend in our sort of modern Western mindset just to think in terms of individuality, right? This person's forgiven, that person's not, or this person's in, that person's not. But they thought way less individualistically and way more collectively in those days. So, as we've said, the priest is making sacrifices on behalf of the whole people. And perhaps what this could mean is that the Pharisee who is striving really hard, living as just a life as they can, as generous a life as they can, as giving a life as they can, something that we would all say that's a good way to live, is actually benefiting the community. It's benefiting the community in all kinds of incredible ways, even benefiting someone who doesn't deserve it, namely the tax collector. And again, maybe we could think of our own lives like that we're striving for righteousness, for justice, for trying to live the right way, trying to stand for the right things, trying to speak out and be people who are about the right things. And rather than thinking, it's just all their fault, those other people who don't necessarily agree with us, that actually somehow they're going to benefit from it as well. This isn't a zero-sum game. It's not about them and us, it's about us. And we can strive and labor for justice and strive and labor for the kind of kingdom, the kind of life that Jesus talks about. And it doesn't have to be exclusive, even of the people that disagree with us, even of the people that don't deserve it. And trust that can overcome. Trust that way of love, that way of inclusion is actually that powerful that it can overcome all that hatred, all that destruction. So when we think about it that way, it takes on a different kind of meaning. So I'm going to we'll just put up a slide here that's going to look at some possible interpretations or some takeaways from this. Again, it's a parable, so I don't want to say this is what it means. But it means, I think, at least way more than that more simplistic approach that we took right at the beginning, which is, at first reading, the most obvious meaning. But it might mean a little bit more than that. So what are possible interpretations? Well, one is kind of very much aligned with that first interpretation we talked about. Don't think too highly of yourself and don't look down on others. That would be a pretty good way to live. Jesus talked about that a lot. The early Christian writers wrote about that a lot. Secondly, some other takeaways. Possible interpretations. It doesn't matter what you do as long as you believe in God's grace. That is a two-edged sword. I mean, does it really not matter what you do? I don't think that's what Jesus said. But God's grace is really powerful. Love is really powerful. Love can overcome all kinds of things. So what's the meaning in that? Next one. Living righteously and justly benefits people who don't deserve it, who we might think might not deserve it. It's not about being right or wrong, but about living a just and whole kind of way. Next one. We seldom know the whole story about someone. Right? You think of our worst enemies, people we know and people who are just sort of out there in cyberspace or on the TV or whatever. We don't know the whole story. And we know that we have a story, right? And we didn't get here on our own. Maybe we do have a more righteous way of looking at the world, a more just way of looking at the world, a more generous way of looking at the world, a more generous way of treating other people. But we're all on a journey. We didn't get there on our own. People helped us with that. We had different experiences that brought us to this place. So just recognizing that means that firstly, we can't really get up on our high horse. And secondly, we shouldn't look down on somebody because everybody's on that journey. Everybody's in process. And then sort of finally on this one, life is not a competition, right? It's not, is this the final one, Greg? Or I think there's one after this, isn't there? One more, yeah. So life, we'll just skip over life is not a competition because, it just isn't, and it's not about, I'm more righteous than somebody else. That's just not the point of life, right? It's not about being better. It's just being real, being true. But finally, we can all partner with God's grace and mercy, or partner in God's grace and mercy. So I think that, for me, that's the biggest takeaway, just personally. Doesn't mean it's the right interpretation. But it's a partnership, right? It's not, God is love. And the point of life is participating in and partnering with that love, rather than sort of owning some sense of being right, some sense of being righteous, of being better than anybody else, and looking down on other people. It's recognizing, as we were saying, that we're all on a journey. We get to participate in loving and forgiving. We get to participate in speaking out on behalf of justice and mercy. We also get to experience that ourselves, and we get to extend it ourselves, recognizing that we're working with God in all this. I love what Maya Angelou says. What humility does for one is it reminds us that there are people before me. I have already been paid for, and what I need to do is prepare myself so that I can pay for someone else who is yet to come, but who may be here and needs me. In other words, people have gone before us, people have influenced us, people have helped us get to where we are now, not so that we would then just think, aren't I great, and look down on somebody, but rather that we could then help other people on that journey. Even people who don't seem to deserve to be on that journey, or we might have fundamental differences with. Jesus is about reconciliation and healing of the world, of individuals, of my own life, but my relationships, society, the whole world. That's the business that Jesus is in. We'll just end with this scripture, which I think gets at a lot of what the parable is trying to say in many respects. On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And we read that or hear that with open ears and open hearts, I think. Except that in light of this parable, it's hard for us to extend mercy to people who we fundamentally disagree with and feel like they're the sinners. And Jesus is not saying they're okay. Jesus is not saying you just need to accept them and what they do and back off. But Jesus is saying extend mercy. And Jesus is saying don't alienate, don't dehumanize. And also Jesus is saying, I've come to call those people. I've come to call the abusive, manipulative, extortionists like the tax collector. That's who Jesus hung out with. That there has to be hope that change is possible. And so I think the parable for me is this call to not giving up hope on anybody, staying true to what we believe to be righteousness, recognizing that actually we're all in need of forgiveness. We're all part of the problem. But remaining true to this journey of justice, remaining true to this journey of righteousness, not giving up on it and not giving up on a single person. And disagreeing and being courageous in our disagreement, but not being self-righteous, which only actually creates more distance, more gap, more fracture in society, rather than the kind of healing that Jesus wants to bring. So we're going to come to communion now. If the band would like to come back up. And, we do this every week as a reminder that we're followers of Jesus. So we're following somebody who is really tricky, I think, really hard to follow, because Jesus never lets us off the hook. It's like, so you think you're right? Maybe you're not. You think you're good? Maybe you're not. Not in a condemning way, but in an inviting way to be transformed, to be changed. So as we eat the crackers and drink the fruit juice, we're remembering Jesus, we're remembering that way, and just saying, okay, just transform me, change me. And that's why we do this every week. And these parables are only of value, really, if we allow them to transform us. There's also lots of other things we can do around the room. And if you're not so familiar with those, just check out the flyer you got when you came in, and there's lots of information about that. We have different stations, and you can light candles in different places. So this is a time where we all just sort of respond in ways that feel right to us. Just like that parable means different things to each of us. We're all in different places right now and sort of want to respond in ways that feel right to us. So there's space and room to do that. I'll just pray, and then the band will lead us in a song, and then just come forward, take the communion, or respond in whatever way we'd like. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we're grateful for your incredible, powerful love and your transformative love, your hopeful love. We are subject to that. We benefit from it, and help us to extend that, to live that out as your followers. May that be our light that shines in the darkness, as you've called us to do. We ask that in your name. Amen.